James Callister had lived alone for 10 years. Since the fever swept through the valley and took his wife and 2 small children, he had never been the same. He no longer looked anyone in the eye for long. He no longer spoke words that weren't strictly necessary. He didn't sell the ranch or pack up his things. He just stayed, like someone waiting for life to end, but not in a hurry. His routine was simple. Too simple. He rose before dawn, fed the chickens, checked the wire fence, tended the stable, drank cold coffee from a chipped mug, and went back to work. Ate little, slept poorly, sometimes didn't sleep at all. The only thing he never failed to do was walk each afternoon to the back of the property, where 3 weathered wooden crosses marked the place where he had buried his family. There he spoke softly, not with prayers, but with broken phrases, sometimes questions, often long silences. That afternoon, the heat was dry and relentless. James was chopping wood near the stream bed, as he did every week. The axe fell with a steady, almost automatic rhythm. Suddenly, a sound broke the routine, something like a moan, a soft, animal-like whimper. James froze with the axe midair. He looked around and stepped toward the bushes growing beside the dry stream. And then he saw her. A woman. Young. Apache. Her skin was caked with dirt. The leather of her dress was blood-stained. Her face drenched in sweat. Her lips cracked, her eyes half shut. A bullet wound in her side had stained her abdomen. James stood still. He watched her for several seconds without moving. He seemed torn between the urge to help and the distrust life had taught him. She barely breathed. Exhausted. Dehydrated. She was not a threat. She was a wounded human being. Without a word, he lifted her with difficulty. She was lighter than he expected. Her legs hung limp. Her head fell against his shoulder. He carried her into the cabin. He laid her on the wooden cot he hadn't used in years. He drew water from the barrel, heated it on the stove, and prepared an herbal infusion. His wife had once grown herbs in a corner of the property: sage, arnica, a little dried mint. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew how to clean a wound. He carefully opened the young woman's shirt. The bullet was still inside. He took a deep breath, washed his hands, sterilized a knife, worked with precision. She didn't scream. She only stirred slightly, unconscious. When he finished, he wiped her face, moistened her lips, covered the wound with a makeshift bandage, then sat by the door, rifle across his lap. Outside, the night had fallen completely. James didn't sleep. He kept his eyes on the shadows stretched across the floor. Occasionally, he turned to check if she was still breathing. The sound was faint, but steadied up by dawn. The silence inside the cabin was heavy. But she was still alive. James approached and studied her closely. She still had a fever, but her pulse held. He moistened her lips again, and then he felt it. It wasn't hope. It was fear. Fear that this woman might also die. Fear of losing someone again. Of burying another name in that field. Of reliving the story that had left him alone. For the first time in a long while, something moved inside him. He didn't know if it was good or bad. He just knew he didn't want her to leave. Chapter 2. A Language Without Words. Ayoka woke up. With a start. Her dark, tense eyes scanned the rustic ceiling of the cabin, as if trying to make sense of where she was. She tried to sit up, but the pain in her side made her let out a stifled groan. The wound was still fresh. She looked around with her muscles tight, like prey trapped in an unknown place. James, who had been peeling potatoes near the stove, stood up quietly. He raised his hands slowly, without getting closer. He said nothing. He knew any sudden move could make her flee or fight. She stared at him with fear, her eyes shining with mistrust. He barely breathed. The young woman tried to crawl toward the door, staggering. She tripped over a chair, fell to her hands, and stayed there, gasping. James didn't move. He just pointed to the bowl of water on the table, then stepped back a few paces so she would see he had no intention of stopping her. She stayed still, looked at the bowl, then at him, pressed her lips together, slowly crawled to the wooden bench, took the water in her hands and, without warning, threw it at his face. James blinked, soaked and stunned. For a second, an awkward silence filled the room. Then he let out a hoarse, almost rusty laugh that echoed through the cabin. He hadn't laughed in months. She didn't understand the reason for his reaction, but the sound didn't seem threatening. She looked at him strangely, as if he were the odd one for not getting angry. The following days, their communication became a mix of gestures, crude drawings on wood, and long silences. James tried to teach her some basic words: water, food, me, you. He drew shapes with charcoal on the table or floor, waiting for her to nod or correct him with her own symbols. She didn't say much, but her eyes followed every move, as if memorizing everything in case she needed to run. She still didn't trust him, but her weak body made escape impossible. Gradually, Ayoka began to move around the cabin with less tension. She didn't turn her back to him, but no longer hid behind furniture. She watched James as he cooked, repaired things, or simply stared out the window with the look of a man who had stopped expecting anything. One night, when she was nearly asleep, she heard a muffled sob. She got up carefully and found James hunched over a chair, covering his face with his hands. His body trembled as if the cold had reached into his bones. He held a portrait of a little girl. Ayoka didn't understand the words he mumbled, but she recognized the language of pain. Memories of his wife and children still haunting his dreams. She approached quietly, took a blanket, and placed it over his shoulders. He looked up, and there, eyes met for the first time without fear, without distance. They said nothing. It wasn't needed to in the nights that followed. Ayoka slept in the bed, while James preferred to stay awake, or if he slept, he sat in a nearby chair with his rifle within reach. The distance between them was tangible, but so was the silent bond forming with every act of care and every shared sunrise. The next day, Ayoka gestured that she wanted to go outside. James hesitated but agreed. He offered her a blanket to shield her from the sun and walked beside her to the small garden. His wife had started years ago. The earth was half dry, but still alive. Ayoka knelt and began working without asking. She pulled weeds, turned the soil, and pointed out certain plants that could be used for making infusions. That same day, she showed him how to boil bark and leaves to sleep better. James didn't understand the names, but he understood the care behind the gesture. That night, for the first time in a long while, he slept without waking in fright. Over the following weeks, she grew stronger, helped with cooking, organized dried herbs, kept the fire going. James still slept in the chair near the door, while she took the bed. He never tried to change that. Some days, they shared soup in silence. Others, he kept trying to teach her new words. Sometimes she corrected him with a slight, teasing smile. They didn't need to talk much. The house slowly filled with shared gestures and a strange routine that didn't belong to either of them, yet included them both. One afternoon, James found Ayoka sitting in front of his daughter's portrait. She touched it gently, as if she understood that the girl still lived in the memories of the man who had taken her in. James watched from the doorway. He said nothing, but in that moment, he knew she was no longer a stranger. She had crossed the threshold of his home, and somehow, also the one in his heart. Chapter 3. The Return of Fire. The relationship between James and Ayoka grew slowly, yet with unexpected strength. There were no touches yet, no spoken words, but long looks said everything they needed. In shared silence, silent laughter bloomed. Effortlessly, and small gestures, once hard to interpret, became a common language. With each passing day, the air between them grew softer, warmer. The solitude James had carried for a decade began to dissolve. Ayoka possessed a special way with horses. In her tribe, animals were more than companions. They were spirits walking alongside them, linked by an invisible bond. She approached James's late wife's horse with calm respect, without force. The animal, closed off since its mistress's death, had rejected all human contact. James had tried to mount it several times, but the horse became agitated, stepped away, or simply refused to move. One late afternoon, as the valley glowed in golden light, Ayoka approached the stable. She placed her hands gently on the horse's back. Closing her eyes, she murmured words in her language, like a prayer. The usually temperamental horse seemed to calm. Its ears turned toward her, its dark eyes opened in trust. Ayoka stroked its mane and moved fluidly, mounting it naturally. James watched in silence, barely believing his eyes. That connection was an invisible bridge between two worlds thought irreconcilable. Ayoka didn't need words. James understood something profound had been born between them, but the day did not end in calm. While gathering firewood near the forest, a sudden electrical storm erupted. Rain began to fall in sheets. Lightning illuminated the sky, and wind battered dead branches. Soaked and tense in their muscles, they ran toward the stable. Inside, horses neighed nervously. The scent of wet earth and damp hay filled the air. James and Ayoka stood face to face, clothes plastered to skin, hair dripping, breath ragged. He took a slow, careful step, as if approaching something fragile and precious. She did not retreat. Their eyes locked, and silence became a space full of promise. James raised his hand gently toward her face. His heart pounded. He wanted to kiss her, to cross the distance that words could not bridge. But just then, a sharp noise shattered the quiet. A group of Apache warriors appeared on the ranch's edge, silhouettes framed against the storming sky. That a voice rang out. Ayoka. It was Kawanika, her older brother. His voice left no room for doubt or refusal. Come with us. It's time to return home. James tried to speak, raised his voice to explain, to plead for peace. But Kawanika would not listen. Without another word, he stepped forward and struck James with a sharp, forceful punch. Ayoka stepped between them instantly, placing her body before her brother's blow. Her eyes, full of struggle and desperation, sought to avert a greater conflict. Tension became palpable, a silent clash between two worlds that would likely never understand each other. The tribe saw James as an enemy, dangerous and intrusive. Ayoka, though she felt a budding love for the man who had saved and cared for her, remained bound by her roots and loyalty to her people. Tears in her eyes, Ayoka explained that she was still weak. She had separated from her group when men attacked them during a medicinal plant gathering. She had arrived alone, vulnerable, and only James had kept her alive. Yet, the call of her people was strong, and her obligation to them bound her irrevocably. Their words were few but intense. Ayoka attempted to reason with her brother, to tell him of the care and tenderness she had found in James, of the warmth returning to her body and soul. But Kawanika remained resolute, unyielding. In the end, Ayoka surrendered. With tears, she agreed to return with her tribe, understanding that her place was not at the ranch, nor with the white man who had transformed her world. James watched her silhouette fade into the gray horizon as storm clouds roared above them, feeling the fire newly lit in his heart extinguish with her departure. He wanted to stop her, to beg her to stay, but his hands were empty, and his soul broken. Ayoka's figure grew smaller. James remained motionless, clinging to silence and the possible promise of a return that might never come. Chapter 4. Footprints in the sand. The ranch lay enveloped in a heavy silence, one that seemed to absorb every corner, every shadow, every memory. Ayoka's absence settled in the air, in the chills seeping into the cabin, in the empty cot that felt like an open wound in James's heart. The bowl that had once held hot soup now sat empty, as if life itself had vanished with her departure. The fire in the hearth, once dancing brightly, had died out, leaving only ashes and a scent of emptiness. James moved through the ranch weighed down by grief. Every spot she had touched brought pain to his chest. The blanket Ayoka had woven with trembling, weary hands, and which he had kept carefully in his wife's chest, now seemed the only thread connecting him to her, to the possibility that not all was lost. The days passed slowly, as if time had stopped in that forgotten valley. James performed his daily chores, but his movements were mechanical, lacking the spark that once helped him face solitude. One night, while repairing the ranch fence under pale moonlight, a sound shattered the stillness, a soft, uneven but persistent gallop. He looked up, his heart racing. In the dim light, a figure staggered toward him. It was Ayoka. Alone, weary, with wounded hands and torn clothing. Her eyes, though full of fatigue, shone with determination. She had ridden 2 days to reach him. Her body bore the effort, but her gaze left no doubt. She had chosen to return. James drew her into a long, silent embrace, without words, without questions, just the warmth of 2 bodies reuniting after feeling the absence of life itself. The world outside disappeared, and time stood still. He offered her water, which she drank eagerly, as if it were the elixir returning her to existence. Then, with slow intent, she leaned in and kissed him for the first time. It was a trembling kiss, heavy with fear and hope, a real, sincere kiss that broke down the distance and barriers built by pain and fear. That night, for the first time, they slept together in the same bed. No promises, no words, only hands entwined, silent contact. Since that, despite the world and everything that separated them, they had found refuge in each other. Ayoka's woven blanket covered them, a symbol of union and sacrifice. Ayoka had made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She had been promised to marry another man from her tribe, a commitment she neither loved nor wanted, but she rejected it entirely. She renounced her tribe, her history, the security it offered, all for the uncertainty of being with a white man in a world that would not accept them. Deep within, James knew he was no longer alone. This woman, with her strength and fragility, had kindled a light in his extinguished life. Yet he also understood that their union would not be free of risk. Kawanaka's gaze and tribal rejection were shadows that would always follow them. He knew their lives could be in danger, that acceptance would be hard, and their path to happiness uphill. But for the first time in a long time, James was willing to face it all, for he had found something worth protecting. True love born amid pain and sacrifice. Night deepened and wind whispered through the trees. James and Ayoka slept together, their choices footprints etched in the sand of that forgotten valley, knowing that the future would be uncertain, but that at least tonight, they were together. Chapter 5. The Scent of Fear. The news spread quickly, like dry brush fires scorching the summer undergrowth. In cantinas and poker tables of neighboring towns, the rumor slithered through mouths like an invisible knife. Widower Callister isn't as alone as he seems. They say an Indian woman lives with him, that she's cast a spell with roots, smoke, and witchcraft that drives men mad. Those words came from mouths poisoned by fear and ignorance, fed by centuries of prejudice. Ayoka hardly left the ranch. But one morning, while collecting water near the streambed, a child saw her. That innocent glance was enough to ignite the spark of prejudice in hardened hearts. To them, in that hostile Arizona of the late 19th century, an Apache woman was not just another indigenous person. She was the symbol of the enemy, an embodiment of what must be feared, expelled, eliminated. Newspapers kept publishing stories of ambushes, slaughter, rebellions. Apaches were violently expelled to reservations, harsh, barren lands where survival was a constant battle. Colonists, fueled by fear, religion, and rage, saw them as a direct threat to their faith, their land, and their way of life. In their minds, a free Indian woman was an uncontrollable danger. But that she lived in a white man's home, that was unforgivable. One afternoon, as the sun slowly sank, two men on horseback rode near the ranch. They dressed like settlers, dusty boots and wide-brimmed hats, but their eyes were calculating, military in instinct, sniffing for anything unusual. One dismounted cautiously, pressed his fingers to the dry soil. The other examined boots and hoofprints near the stable. "He doesn't live alone," one whispered. "He has company. And she's not Christian," added the other gravely. James watched them from inside the cabin's shadows. They didn't approach or speak, only looked with cold eyes. They left on a trail of dust, as if they already knew what they would do. That night, in the town saloon, the sheriff half listened to whispers thick with beer and resentment. That Indian woman could be dangerous. You know what they do, bewitch men, pull them away from God. Maybe she's helping Apaches move through the area, another replied suspiciously. If we hand her over to the post, we earn the colonel's favor and cleanse this land, declared a third, confident like a judge issuing sentence. The excuse was clear and cruel. A fugitive without papers, living outside her reservation, residing with a white man. That broke the law of the land, the law of men, and, according to some, the law of God. In their eyes, she was a danger to be eradicated, a symbol of an intolerable threat. Days later, rumor became order. An unofficial patrol, men without uniforms, but armed with rifles, formed. They moved like shadows, silent, resolute, carrying out what many called justice. Meanwhile, over the ranch, storm clouds gathered. The wind tossed branches, the air thick with tension, a feeling in every corner. James looked at Ayoka with firm, worried voice. They are coming. Soon. They don't care who you are. Only what you represent. She didn't flinch. Her eyes reflected calm defiance. From that moment, they prepared for the inevitable. James reinforced windows with thick wooden boards, guarding against surprise entry. Ayoka cooked extra food, wrapped it carefully in cloth, and stored it. Instead of burying memories, James cleaned his old rifle, his calm hands sharpening resolve. This time he wouldn't flee pain. This time, he would face it. Darkness fell like a heavy cloak, waited, with quiet and glances that spoke louder than words. Outside, the wind seemed to whisper warnings, but inside the ranch, the only sound was the shared heartbeat of two souls ready to endure. Chapter 6. Fire and Redemption. Night fell without a moon, dark and silent like the mystery hidden in shadows. On the ranch, only the whisper of the wind caressed dry leaves. But that calm was a deception, a pause before the approaching storm. Suddenly, the silence shattered with the roar of gunfire and screams. Armed men, hidden in darkness, stormed in violently. They set the corral ablaze, ruthless flames licking at dry wood and piled hay. The smell of smoke mingled with fear in the air. James reacted instantly, gripping his old rifle with steady hands despite the exhaustion and uncertainty pressing on him. He fired into the shadows, attempting to repel the attackers. His heart pounded at a frantic pace. Each bullet was a desperate plea to defend what was now his, the ranch, and the life he had begun building with Ayoka. She did not stand back. Knowing she could not remain still and vulnerable, she hid among the shadows, breath held, and drew a knife she had learned to wield as a child. Her eyes shone with determination and fear, but also with the strength of someone fighting for love and survival. The battle seemed lost. The fire grew relentless, and the armed men advanced with cruel intent. Then, from the nearby hillside, a roar erupted. Apache warriors burst into the scene like ghosts in the darkness. Their voices echoed with an ancestral war cry that resounded through the valley. Kawanaka, Ayoka's brother, led the group. He hadn't come for James, but for his sister, to rescue her and return her to their people. His eyes, full of fury and concern, locked onto his sister, then shifted to the man beside her. What followed was brief but brutal. Weapons clashed, cries pierced the night, and the scent of gunpowder and blood filled the air. The colonists, surprised and outnumbered, had no choice but to flee into the darkness, dust rising from their horses' hooves. When peace returned, James lay wounded on the ground, blood flowing from a deep injury. Ayoka immediately knelt beside him. Her trembling hands began to clean the wound, while tears fell, mingling with dust and blood. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. Kawanaka watched silently, his eyes weighing the scene. For the first time, he recognized the true love his sister felt for that man. Love that defied traditions, prejudice, and danger, and that had risked her life and safety to save her sister. With effort, the Apache warriors helped carry James back to the house. Ayoka walked beside him, supporting him carefully, aware of the severity of his wound. Once inside, they laid him on the old cot, and she knelt beside him. With hands steady yet gentle, she began cleaning the wound, her fingers tracing the skin stained with dust and blood. Chapter 7. The Right to Stay. The night passed and danger faded, but the wounds remained. At dawn, James awoke beside Ayoka, still aching from the impact of a bullet that had grazed him. Kawanaka, Ayoka's brother, stayed close the entire time. He didn't say much, but the tension between him and James was palpable. Finally, Kawanaka laid out a clear agreement. For him to accept that his sister remained with James, James had to allow the tribe to freely use part of his land that had once belonged to them before it was fenced off and divided by settlers. He also had to swear that he would always put his life before Ayoka's, that he would protect her, and if he failed, Kawanaka himself would take his life. James accepted without hesitation. He knew that giving up that land was an act of justice, a way to honor the past and ensure peace. The tribe returned to the ranch, not to stay permanently, but to reconnect with the land that had been taken from them and to honor Ayoka's choice. The tribe held a simple ceremony near the ranch: fire, sage smoke, a circle of stones, and water from an ancestral spring. Ayoko wore a red cloak, a symbol of her new role as a free woman and healer. Kawanaka watched as James cared for Ayoka. No words were spoken, only a silent understanding. The union between Ayoka and James was not only about love, it was a new beginning for them, and for those who had no place in the world. The ranch, once isolated and lonely, now carried the spirit of a small community, a refuge for those seeking belonging and hope. Chapter 8. The Ranch Pact. After Kawanaka allowed James and Ayoka to live in peace, the couple began transforming the ranch into a refuge for their people. A portion of the land was designated for building a school, a living symbol of union between cultures. In this school, not only indigenous children but also settler youth began to study together, learning the traditions and knowledge of both worlds. This shared learning represented hope for a future where respect and collaboration would form the foundation of peace. However, not all settlers welcomed this cultural closeness. Some, clinging to prejudice and fear, were resistant, even hostile, to the idea of their children sharing space with indigenous youth. But thanks to James's constant mediation and Ayoka's spiritual leadership, the project moved forward, creating new paths for the next generation to break down those barriers. The women cultivated specific plots of land, planting corn, squash, and medicinal herbs that nourished and healed the community. The ranch, located an hour from the settlers' town, became a self-sufficient home. Still, the relationship with nearby settlers remained tense and fragile. To avoid conflict, James negotiated an agreement. The indigenous community could live and farm on the ranch land, but they were strictly forbidden from crossing the fence that marked its boundary or approaching the town. Likewise, the settlers would not enter the ranch or approach the community. James assured them that as long as the settlers respected that boundary, there would be no attacks or confrontations. Thus, a clear border was established and respected by both sides, based on trust and mutual respect. Over time, the ranch became a symbol of peaceful resistance, a living legacy proving that coexistence was possible without anyone having to give up their identity.